The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his bearskin cap for what felt like the 100th time that day. He had been a member of the Queen's Guard for nearly 15 years, and in all that time, he had never encountered a situation quite like the one that would unfold on this crisp autumn morning in October 2023. Thomas stood at his post near the palace gates, his scarlet tunic pristine, and his expression stoic as tourists snapped photographs from behind the iron railings. The familiar weight of tradition rested on his shoulders, a responsibility he had carried with pride since the day he first donned the uniform. His father had served before him, and his grandfather before that, making the Mitchell family name synonymous with unwavering loyalty to the crown. The palace had been buzzing with unusual energy for weeks. Since the coronation earlier that year, there had been a palpable shift in the atmosphere within the royal household. Staff members whispered in corridors, their conversations ceasing abruptly whenever someone in authority approached. Thomas had noticed the changes too, new protocols being implemented, traditional procedures being questioned, and a general sense of unease that seemed to permeate the very walls of the ancient building. On this particular morning, Thomas had arrived at his post earlier than usual. The head of the guard had summoned all senior members for a briefing, emphasizing the importance of maintaining absolute professionalism in what he cryptically referred to as challenging times. The message was clear without being explicit. Tensions were running high within the palace, and the guards were expected to navigate these troubled waters with their characteristic stoicism. As Thomas stood motionless, his trained eyes scanning the crowds of tourists, he couldn't help but reflect on the recent changes. The new queen consort, Camilla, had been asserting her position with increasing frequency. While the public face of the monarchy remained united, those within the palace walls knew of the subtle power struggles playing out behind closed doors. The incident that would change everything began innocuously enough. A black Bentley approached the palace gates, its windows tinted to obscure the occupants from view. Thomas recognized it immediately as one of the royal vehicles, though it wasn't scheduled to arrive for another hour according to the duty roster he had memorized that morning. The car came to a stop directly in front of Thomas's position. The rear door opened, and Queen Camilla emerged, dressed in an elegant navy blue coat dress with matching hat. Her expression was one of determination, her jaw set in a way that suggested she was prepared for confrontation. Behind her, two ladies in waiting hurried to keep pace, their faces betraying their anxiety. Thomas maintained his position, eyes forward as protocol demanded. He had seen members of the royal family come and go countless times, and his training dictated that he remain at his post unless directly addressed or unless specific security protocols required his intervention. But Camilla did not simply walk past as expected. Instead, she stopped directly in front of Thomas, positioning herself so that ignoring her would be impossible. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the murmur of tourists who had begun to realize something unusual was happening. "Guard," Camilla said, her voice carrying the cultivated tones of the upper class, but with an edge that suggested barely controlled emotion. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you." This presented Thomas with an immediate dilemma. Protocol was clear. Guard were not to break their stance or make eye contact unless specific circumstances demanded it. Yet here was the queen consort, giving him a direct order that contradicted his training. Thomas remained motionless, his training winning out over the uncomfortable situation. He could feel the weight of Camilla's gaze upon him, could sense the growing tension in the air as tourists began to raise their phones, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. "I said, look at me," Camilla repeated, her voice rising slightly. One of her ladies-in-waiting stepped forward as if to intervene, but stopped when Camilla raised her hand sharply. Thomas could feel sweat beginning to form beneath his heavy uniform despite the cool morning air. He had been trained for many scenarios: terrorist threats, aggressive protesters, medical emergencies, but no one had prepared him for a direct confrontation with a member of the royal family. The situation escalated when Camilla took a step closer, now standing mere inches from Thomas. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, her voice low but intense. I am your queen. When I give you an order, you follow it." The word queen hung in the air like a challenge. While Camilla held the title of queen consort, the distinction between that and the queen regnant was significant, though rarely spoken of openly. It was a sensitivity that everyone in the palace understood, but never addressed directly. Thomas's mind raced as he tried to determine the appropriate response. His duty was to the crown, to the institution of the monarchy, not to any individual within it. Yet here was a member of the royal family demanding his attention in a way that put him in an impossible position. The crowd of tourists had grown larger now, phones raised to capture every moment of this unprecedented scene. Thomas could hear the whispers, the speculation, the excitement of witnessing what appeared to be a breakdown in royal protocol. "Your Majesty," Thomas finally spoke, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. "I am duty-bound to maintain my post." It was a diplomatic response, acknowledging her title while not directly defying her order. But Camilla was not satisfied with diplomacy. "Your duty," she said, emphasizing each word, "is to your queen. And I'm telling you that I want you to acknowledge me properly. Look at me." The ladies-in-waiting exchanged worried glances. This was beyond a simple breach of protocol. This was becoming a public spectacle that would undoubtedly make headlines around the world. One of them attempted to speak quietly to Camilla, perhaps suggesting they continue this conversation inside, but she was waved away impatiently. Thomas could feel the weight of history pressing down upon him. The Queen's Guard had stood watch over British monarchs for centuries, maintaining their discipline through wars, scandals, and societal upheavals. They were symbols of continuity, of tradition, of an unshakable dedication to duty that transcended individual personalities or preferences. But they were also human beings, caught in the complex dynamics of a changing institution. Thomas knew that whatever he did in the next few moments would have consequences far beyond this morning's confrontation. He could break protocol and acknowledge Camilla as she demanded, potentially setting a precedent that would undermine the Guard's traditional independence. Or he could maintain his stance and risk escalating a situation that was already spiraling out of control. As he stood there, frozen in indecision, Thomas couldn't help but think about the broader context of this moment. The monarchy had been through a period of significant change and upheaval. The transition of power, the shifting public perceptions, the delicate balance between tradition and modernization. All of these factors had created an environment where incidents like this seemed almost inevitable. Camilla's insistence on being acknowledged as queen rather than queen consort spoke to deeper insecurities and power dynamics within the royal household. It was an open secret that she had faced resistance from various quarters, both within the palace and among the public. This confrontation with the Guard seemed to be about more than just protocol. It was about respect, recognition, and the validation of her position. The tourists continued to film, their excitement palpable. Social media would ensure that this moment would be shared around the world within minutes. Thomas could already imagine the headlines, the analysis, the endless speculation about what this meant for the monarchy. "I'm waiting," Camilla said, her patience clearly wearing thin. "This is a simple request. Acknowledge your queen." Thomas felt the weight of generations of guards who had stood in this very spot, who had faced down threats and challenges with unwavering discipline. He thought of his father, who had served during times of scandal and upheaval, but had never wavered in his duty. He thought of the oath he had taken, the pride he felt in wearing the uniform, the responsibility he bore to maintain the traditions that had defined the Guard for centuries. The morning air seemed to grow colder as the standoff continued. Palace staff had begun to notice the commotion, faces appearing at windows, security personnel speaking urgently into their radios. It was clear that this situation could not continue much longer without intervention from higher authorities. But Camilla seemed determined to see this through. Her face was flushed with emotion, her hands clenched at her sides. This was not the composed, dignified figure the public was accustomed to seeing. This was a woman pushed to her breaking point, demanding recognition and respect in the most public way possible. Thomas's training had covered many scenarios, but none quite like this. He had been taught to deal with threats, to remain calm under pressure, to represent the steadfastness of the British monarchy. But what happened when the threat came from within? What was the proper protocol when a member of the royal family themselves became the source of disruption? The ladies-in-waiting were growing increasingly agitated. One of them had her phone out, presumably trying to contact someone who could defuse the situation. The other continued to speak quietly to Camilla, her words lost in the morning air, but her tone clearly pleading. As Thomas stood there, he became aware of movement behind the palace gates. Senior officials were emerging, their faces grave as they assessed the situation. He recognized the Lord Chamberlain among them, the man ultimately responsible for the smooth running of the royal household. Help was coming, but it might not arrive in time to prevent this situation from escalating further. Camilla must have noticed the approaching officials as well, because her demeanor shifted slightly. There was a new urgency to her demands, as if she knew her window of opportunity was closing. "This is your last chance," she said to Thomas, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "Show me the respect I deserve, or there will be consequences." The threat hung in the air, vague but ominous. What consequences could she mean? Could a guard be dismissed for following protocol? The very idea seemed to strike at the heart of everything the institution represented. Thomas felt as though he was standing at a crossroads, not just of his own career, but of the monarchy itself. The old ways, the traditions that had sustained the institution through centuries of change, were being challenged in real time. The question was whether those traditions could bend without breaking, whether they could accommodate the desires and demands of individuals while maintaining their essential character. The Lord Chamberlain was approaching now, his pace quick but dignified. Relief flooded through Thomas. Surely someone in authority would know how to handle this situation. But there was still time for things to go wrong, for words to be said that couldn't be taken back, for actions to be taken that would reverberate through history. Camilla seemed to sense that her moment was slipping away. She took another step closer to Thomas, close enough that he could see the determination in her eyes, the frustration that had built up over months or perhaps years of feeling sidelined or disrespected. "I am your queen," she said one more time, her voice carrying a mixture of authority and desperation. "And I demand that you acknowledge me as such." The words seemed to echo across the courtyard, captured by dozens of phones, witnessed by tourists who would tell this story for years to come. Thomas stood at the center of it all, a man caught between duty and demand, between tradition and change, between the past and an uncertain future. As the Lord Chamberlain drew closer, as the ladies-in-waiting continued their quiet pleas, as the tourists held their collective breath, Thomas made his decision. It was a choice that would define not just his own future, but would send ripples through the institution he had sworn to serve. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting shorter shadows across the ancient stones of Buckingham Palace. What had begun as an ordinary day had transformed into a moment of extraordinary significance, a confrontation that would force the monarchy to confront questions about power, protocol, and the price of tradition in a changing world. The stage was set for a response that would change the palace forever, a simple guard's answer to a complex question about authority, respect, and the nature of service in the modern age. Thomas Mitchell, a man who had spent his career in silent service, was about to speak words that would echo through the corridors of power and across the pages of history. The Lord Chamberlain was still 20 paces away when Thomas Mitchell made his decision. Drawing upon years of training and a lifetime of family tradition, he shifted his stance ever so slightly, not enough to break protocol entirely, but sufficient to indicate he was about to speak. The subtle movement caught Camilla's attention, and for a moment, hope flickered across her features. "Your Majesty," Thomas began, his voice carrying the measured tones of someone who had chosen their words with infinite care. "With the deepest respect, I must inform you that my duty is to the crown itself, not to any individual who wears it." The words fell into the morning air like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond the palace gates. Camilla's face transformed from hopeful anticipation to shock, then to something approaching rage. The tourists' collective intake of breath was audible, their phones capturing every micro-expression, every tremor of emotion that crossed the queen consort's features. "How dare you?" Camilla whispered, though in the hushed atmosphere of the moment, her words carried clearly. "How dare you speak to me in such a manner? I am not any individual. I am your queen." Thomas maintained his composure, though internally he felt as though he had stepped off a cliff. "Ma'am, the Queen's Guard has served the institution of the monarchy since 1660. We serve the crown, whoever bears it, but our protocols exist to ensure that service remains above personal consideration or preference." The Lord Chamberlain had quickened his pace, clearly recognizing that the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Behind him, other senior palace officials were emerging, their faces masks of professional concern. Among them, Thomas recognized the captain of the Queen's Guard, his own commanding officer, whose expression suggested he was witnessing his worst nightmare unfold in real time. Camilla turned to face the approaching officials, her voice rising. "Lord Chamberlain, I want this man removed from his post immediately. He has shown gross disrespect to his queen." The Lord Chamberlain, Sir William Hartley, was a man who had navigated palace politics for over 2 decades. His face remained carefully neutral as he approached, though Thomas could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. How to defuse this situation, how to minimize damage, how to preserve the dignity of all involved. "Your Majesty," Sir William said, bowing deeply. "Perhaps we might continue this discussion inside. The morning air is quite sharp, and—" "No." Camilla's voice cracked like a whip. "I want this addressed here and now. This guard has insulted me in front of witnesses. He has questioned my authority, undermined my position. I want him removed." The tourists were no longer even pretending to be discreet. Phones were raised openly, recording every word, every gesture. Thomas could already imagine the videos spreading across social media, the headlines that would dominate tomorrow's papers, the constitutional experts who would be called upon to analyze every aspect of this confrontation. Sir William's diplomatic skills were being tested to their limit. "Your Majesty, Guard Mitchell is one of our most experienced and decorated guards. I'm certain there has been a misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding," Camilla interrupted. "He refuses to acknowledge me as his queen. He speaks of serving the crown as if it's some abstract concept rather than the person who wears it. This is insubordination of the highest order." The captain of the Queen's Guard stepped forward, his military bearing evident in every movement. Captain James Reynolds had served in Afghanistan before taking up his position at the palace, and he brought that battlefield composure to this decidedly different kind of conflict. "Your Majesty," Captain Reynolds said, his voice respectful but firm, Guard Mitchell was following established protocol. The Queen's Guard maintains fixed positions and does not break stance except in specific circumstances outlined in standing orders that date back centuries. Camilla rounded on him, her carefully styled hair beginning to escape from beneath her hat as she moved. "Then perhaps it's time those protocols were updated. We are not living in the 17th century, Captain. I am not asking for the moon. I'm asking for basic respect and acknowledgement from those who claim to serve the crown." One of Camilla's ladies-in-waiting, Lady Sarah Pemberton, attempted once more to intervene. "Ma'am, please, the press. Let them watch," Camilla declared. "Let the whole world see how I am treated in my own palace. Let them see the disrespect, the stubborn clinging to outdated traditions that have no place in a modern monarchy." Thomas remained at his post throughout this exchange, though every fiber of his being wanted to either flee or further explain his position. He could feel the eyes of his fellow guards upon him from their positions around the palace. He knew they were all wondering the same thing. What would they have done in his place? The situation took another turn when a new figure emerged from the palace. Prince William, heir to the throne, strode across the courtyard with purposeful steps. His arrival sent a murmur through the crowd of tourists, and even some of the palace staff seemed surprised to see him. "What's going on here?" William asked, his tone carefully neutral as he surveyed the scene. His eyes moved from Camilla's flushed face to Thomas's rigid stance, to the cluster of officials trying to manage the crisis. Camilla immediately turned to him, perhaps seeing an ally. "William, this guard has shown me tremendous disrespect. He refuses to acknowledge my authority, hiding behind protocols and traditions as an excuse for insubordination." William's expression remained unreadable as he listened. Thomas had observed the prince many times over the years and knew him to be a thoughtful, measured individual who rarely acted impulsively. The prince's arrival added another layer of complexity to an already fraught situation. "Guard Mitchell," William said, addressing Thomas directly. "Can you explain what happened?" This put Thomas in another difficult position. Protocol dictated that he shouldn't break stance, but a direct question from the heir to the throne demanded a response. He made a small adjustment to his position, enough to indicate he was addressing the prince while maintaining his essential posture. "Your Royal Highness," Thomas said, his voice steady. "Her Majesty requested that I break protocol to acknowledge her in a manner inconsistent with standing orders. I explained that my duty is to maintain my post according to the traditions and regulations of the Queen's Guard." William nodded slowly, then turned to Camilla. "I understand your frustration," he said carefully. "But the Guard's protocols exist for important reasons. They ensure consistency, security, and they ensure that I am treated as less than I am." Camilla interjected, her composure finally cracking completely. "Do you know what it's like, William, to walk through these halls every day, knowing that half the staff still see me as an interloper? To have to fight for every ounce of respect, every acknowledgement of my position?" The rawness in her voice seemed to catch everyone off guard. This was no longer about protocol or tradition. This was about years of perceived slights, accumulated resentments, and the complex dynamics of a blended royal family still finding its equilibrium. William's expression softened slightly. "I understand this has been difficult." "No, you don't understand," Camilla said, her voice now trembling with emotion. "You were born to this. Your position has never been questioned, your authority never doubted. You don't know what it's like to have to prove yourself every single day, to have every gesture scrutinized, every word analyzed for signs that you're overstepping your bounds." The tourists had fallen completely silent now, recognizing that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple breach of protocol. This was a window into the human dynamics behind the ceremonial facade, a glimpse of the real people struggling with extraordinary circumstances. Sir William Hartley attempted to regain control of the situation. "Your Majesty, your Royal Highness, perhaps we should—" But Camilla wasn't finished. She turned back to Thomas, who had maintained his position throughout this emotional revelation. "Do you see?" she asked him directly. "Do you see what your rigid adherence to tradition does? It keeps people in boxes, defines them by rules written centuries ago. You say you serve the crown, but what is the crown without the people who embody it?" Thomas felt the weight of her words, understanding for perhaps the first time the depth of frustration that had led to this confrontation. Yet he also felt the weight of his duty, the oath he had taken, the generations of guards who had stood where he stood. "Ma'am," he said quietly, breaking protocol now to speak directly to her. "I mean no disrespect. The traditions I uphold are not meant to diminish anyone. They exist to serve something greater than any of us, the continuity and stability of the institution we all serve." "But at what cost?" Camilla asked, and for a moment, her voice carried more sadness than anger. "At what cost do we maintain these traditions?" The philosophical question hung in the air, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. It was a question that went to the heart of the monarchy's modern dilemma: how to balance tradition with evolution, how to maintain relevance while preserving history, how to be both symbol and human. Captain Reynolds stepped forward slightly. "Your Majesty, Guard Mitchell is one of our finest. His family has served the crown for generations. If he is given offense, I assure you it was not intentional." "Intent is irrelevant if the effect is the same," Camilla replied, though some of the fire had gone out of her voice. "I'm tired of being treated as somehow less legitimate, less deserving of respect, than those who came before me. William seemed to make a decision. "Guard Mitchell," he said, "while maintaining your post, would you be able to offer Her Majesty some form of acknowledgement that respects both your duties and her position?" It was a diplomatic attempt at compromise, and Thomas recognized it as such. He considered his options carefully, aware that every person present, from the palace officials to the tourists with their phones, was waiting for his response. After a long moment, Thomas made a slight adjustment to his stance, turning his head just enough to make brief eye contact with Camilla while maintaining his essential position. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying formal respect, "I acknowledge you as Queen Consort, wife of our king, and deserving of all honors that position entails. My adherence to protocol is not a judgment on your person or position, but a fulfillment of my sworn duty to serve the crown through established traditions." It was a careful response, acknowledging her while maintaining the principles he had sworn to uphold. Camilla studied him for a long moment, and Thomas could see the conflict in her eyes, the desire to push further warring with the recognition that she had perhaps already pushed too far. The Lord Chamberlain seized upon this moment of relative calm. "Your Majesty, the morning schedule includes several important engagements. Perhaps we might proceed inside." But the damage, if that's what it was, had already been done. The confrontation had been witnessed, recorded, and would soon be broadcast around the world. The careful facade of royal unity and protocol had been cracked open, revealing the very human tensions beneath. Camilla stood still for another moment, seeming to weigh her options. Around her, the machinery of palace management was already spinning into motion. Press officers mentally drafting statements, security personnel preparing to manage the crowd of tourists, senior officials calculating the ramifications of what had just occurred. "This isn't over," Camilla finally said, though it wasn't clear if she was addressing Thomas, the assembled officials, or perhaps the institution itself. "These antiquated systems that prioritize rigid tradition over basic human dignity, they need to change." She turned on her heel and began walking toward the palace entrance, her ladies-in-waiting hurrying to keep up. The click of her heels on the cobblestones seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet that followed her declaration. William lingered for a moment, his eyes moving between Thomas and the retreating figure of his stepmother. "Guard Mitchell," he said quietly, "you acted with honor. But we may all need to think carefully about how we balance tradition with the needs of a changing institution." With that, he too departed, leaving Thomas at his post with the weight of the morning's events settling upon his shoulders like a lead cloak. The tourists began to disperse slowly, their excited chatter filling the air as they reviewed the videos they had captured, already sharing them with friends and family around the world. Captain Reynolds approached Thomas once the immediate crowd had thinned. "Mitchell," he said quietly, "you'll need to file a full report. This is going to cause waves." Thomas nodded, maintaining his position even as he responded. "Yes, sir. I stand by my actions." "I know you do," Reynolds replied. "And for what it's worth, you handled an impossible situation with dignity. But this isn't going to simply blow over. What happened here today, it's going to force conversations that have been avoided for too long." As Reynolds walked away, Thomas was left alone with his thoughts and his duty. The familiar weight of his bearskin cap, the stiff fabric of his scarlet tunic, the solid ground beneath his feet, all of it felt somehow different now, charged with new meaning by the morning's events. He thought about Camilla's words, about the pain and frustration evident in her voice. He thought about the tradition he represented, the generations of guards who had stood silent watch through times of peace and turmoil. He thought about the future, about what the monarchy might look like if it shed the very traditions that had defined it for centuries. The sun climbed higher, warming the ancient stones of the palace despite the autumn chill. Tourists continued to arrive, most unaware of the drama that had unfolded just hours before. But Thomas knew that by evening, the whole world would be discussing what had happened, analyzing every word, every gesture, every implication of the confrontation between a queen consort demanding recognition and a guard standing firm in his duty. As he stood there, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he had been present at a turning point, a moment when the tensions that had been building within the palace finally burst into public view. The question now was what would come next. Would the institution adapt to accommodate these challenges, or would it hold firm to traditions that some saw as increasingly anachronistic? The palace behind him seemed to loom larger than usual, its windows reflecting the morning sun like watching eyes. Somewhere within those walls, conversations were undoubtedly taking place, decisions being made that would shape the response to this morning's events. Press releases were being drafted, strategies developed, damage control implemented. But for Thomas Mitchell, standing at his post as guards had done for centuries before him, there was only duty. The same duty that had led him to speak those fateful words, to make a choice between personal deference and institutional principle. He had changed the palace forever with his answer, though what form that change would take remained to be seen. The morning's drama had subsided, but its echoes would reverberate through the corridors of power for days, weeks, perhaps years to come. A simple guard's refusal to break protocol had exposed fault lines within the royal family, forced uncomfortable questions about tradition and modernization, and challenged everyone involved to consider what the monarchy should be in the 21st century. The BY evening. The video had been viewed over 50 million times across various social media platforms. News channels ran continuous loops of the confrontation, bringing in body language experts, constitutional scholars, and former palace insiders to dissect every moment. The hashtag Queen versus Guard trended globally, with opinions sharply divided between those who supported Camilla's demand for respect and those who praised Thomas Mitchell's adherence to tradition. Inside Buckingham Palace, an emergency meeting had been convened in the Queen and room, its gilded mirrors reflecting the tense faces of the royal family's most senior advisors. King Charles III sat at the head of the mahogany table, his expression grave as he listened to the crisis management team's assessment of the situation. "The public reaction is more divided than we anticipated," said Miranda Ashworth, the palace's director of communications. She gestured to a tablet displaying real-time social media analytics. Approximately 40% support Her Majesty's position, citing the need for modernization and respect for her role. 35% support Guard Mitchell, viewing him as a defender of tradition. The remainder are either neutral or using this as an opportunity to question the monarchy itself. Charles rubbed his temples, a gesture that those close to him recognized as a sign of deep frustration. "Where's Camilla now?" "Her Majesty is in her private apartments," Sir William Hartley responded carefully. "She has declined to attend this meeting, stating that she will not participate in what she termed a discussion about her legitimacy." A heavy silence fell over the room. Through the tall windows, they could see additional security barriers being erected around the palace perimeter, a precaution against the crowds of protesters and supporters who had begun to gather as news of the incident spread. "And Guard Mitchell?" Charles asked. Captain Reynolds, who had been invited to provide military perspective, cleared his throat. "He's currently off duty, Your Majesty, at his home in Richmond. The media have surrounded his house, but he's maintaining silence as per our instructions. His wife and 2 children are with him." "Good God," Charles muttered. "His family is being dragged into this as well." "I'm afraid so, sir. We've offered to relocate them temporarily, but Mitchell declined. He says he won't be driven from his home." Prince William, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "We need to consider the broader implications here. This isn't just about one incident. It's exposed tensions that have been simmering since father's accession to the throne. The unspoken reference to the complex history between Charles, Camilla, and the late Princess Diana hung in the air. It was a ghost that haunted every discussion about Camilla's role and public perception. The question," William continued, "is how we move forward. Do we support Camilla's position and risk alienating those who value tradition? Or do we back the Guard's actions and potentially deepen Camilla's sense of isolation?" "With respect, Your Royal Highness," interjected Sir Marcus Pemberley, the Lord Chancellor, "this may be about more than personal feelings. There are constitutional implications to consider. The role of the Queen Consort versus the Queen Regnant has always been clearly defined. if we begin to blur those lines based on personal preference? Are you suggesting my wife doesn't deserve full recognition of her position? Charles's voice carried a sharp edge that made several advisors shift uncomfortably in their seats. Not at all, Your Majesty, Sir Marcus replied smoothly. I'm merely pointing out that any changes to protocol must be carefully considered. The monarchy's stability rests on predictability and tradition. Meanwhile, in her private sitting room, Camilla stood by the window, watching the crowds gathering beyond the palace gates. Lady Sarah Pemberton sat nearby, having refused to leave her mistress alone despite Camilla's initial demands for solitude. They're calling for my resignation, Camilla said quietly, noting the placards visible even from this distance. Some of them, anyway. Others seem to be supporting me. How did it come to this, Sarah? Lady Sarah chose her words carefully. Ma'am, you touched a nerve today. Not just about protocol, but about change, about recognition, about the role of women in traditional institutions. Camilla turned from the window, and Sarah was struck by how tired she looked. The carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the strain of the day's events. I never wanted to be seen as a revolutionary, Camilla said, sinking into an armchair. I simply wanted to be acknowledged for who I am, for the role I fill. Is that so unreasonable? Of course not, ma'am. But the guard was doing his duty, I know, Camilla interrupted. I've had hours to think about it, to replay the scene in my mind. He wasn't being deliberately disrespectful. He was caught between impossible choices, just as I have been for years. She picked up her phone, scrolling through the endless commentary about the morning's events. They're calling him a hero, you know. Thomas Mitchell, defender of tradition against the demanding queen consort. Ma'am, you shouldn't read those, but others are calling me brave, Camilla continued. A woman standing up against outdated systems, demanding the respect I deserve. Both narratives have truth to them, don't they? A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. A footman entered, bowing deeply. Your Majesty, Guard Mitchell has requested an audience with you. Both women looked up in surprise. Mitchell is here? In the palace? Camilla asked. Yes, ma'am. He arrived 10 minutes ago, having managed to evade the media. He says he wishes to speak with you privately about this morning's events. Camilla stood slowly, smoothing her skirt. Did Charles send him? He says not, ma'am. He claims to be here of his own accord. After a moment's hesitation, Camilla nodded. Show him to the blue drawing room. I'll meet him there in 5 minutes. As the footman departed, Lady Sarah rose. Shall I accompany you, ma'am? No, Camilla said firmly. This conversation should be between Guard Mitchell and myself alone. Thomas Mitchell stood in the blue drawing room, his civilian clothes feeling strange after spending most of his waking hours in uniform. He had never been in this part of the palace before, and the opulence of the surroundings, the silk wallpaper, the priceless paintings, the antique furniture, served as a reminder of the gulf between his world and that of the woman he was about to meet. He turned as the door opened, and Camilla entered alone. For a moment, they simply regarded each other, the morning's confrontation hanging between them like an invisible barrier. Your Majesty, Thomas said, offering a deep bow that he hoped conveyed the respect his rigid stance that morning had not. Guard Mitchell, Camilla acknowledged, gesturing to a pair of chairs near the fireplace. Please sit. I admit I'm surprised to see you here. Thomas remained standing until she had taken her seat, then lowered himself carefully into the chair opposite. I felt I needed to explain myself, ma'am. Not to excuse my actions, but to help you understand them. Camilla studied him with interest. Without his uniform, he seemed both more and less imposing, more human, certainly, but also somehow diminished without the trappings of his office. Go on, she said simply. Thomas had rehearsed this speech during his clandestine journey to the palace, but now the words seemed inadequate. Ma'am, when I put on that uniform, I become something more than myself. I become a link in a chain that stretches back over 300 years. Every guard who has ever stood post has faced moments of choice, when to bend, when to stand firm, when tradition must yield to necessity, and when it must hold. He paused, gathering his thoughts. This morning, you asked me to see you, to acknowledge you. But the truth is, I did see you. I saw a woman fighting for recognition, for respect, for her place in an institution that can be unforgiving to those who don't fit its traditional molds. Camilla's expression softened slightly. Then, why? Because if I had broken protocol for you, ma'am, what precedent would that set? Would the next guard be expected to break stance for any royal who demanded it? Would our traditions become subject to individual whim rather than institutional continuity? Traditions change, Guard Mitchell. They must, or they become prisons. Yes, ma'am, they do change, but slowly, deliberately, with consideration for consequences. Not in moments of emotion or confrontation. They sat in silence for a moment, the crackling of the fire the only sound. Finally, Camilla spoke. Do you know what it's like to always be compared to a ghost, Guard Mitchell? To know that no matter what you do, you'll never measure up to a memory that grows more perfect with each passing year. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. The reference to Diana was unmistakable. I can't imagine, ma'am. I've spent years trying to find my place, to serve the crown, and support my husband while knowing that many wish I would simply disappear. This morning, when I saw you standing there, so rigid, so unmovable, you became every barrier I've faced, every tradition used to keep me at arm's length. I'm sorry for that, ma'am. Truly, it was never my intent to add to your burden. Camilla rose and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens now shrouded in evening darkness. Intent, she said softly. My husband's advisors keep talking about intent, about constitutional implications, about precedent. But sometimes I wonder if they forget that at the center of all these discussions are human beings trying to do their best in impossible situations. Thomas stood as well, recognizing the shift in her mood. Ma'am, if I may, the fact that you're here, filling this role despite all the challenges, shows a strength that traditions and protocols can't measure. The guard's rigidity isn't a judgment on you. It's a promise to the nation that some things remain constant even as the world changes around them. Camilla turned back to him, and Thomas was surprised to see tears in her eyes. And yet change must come, mustn't it? The monarchy can't survive as a museum piece. No, ma'am. But perhaps the change comes not from breaking traditions, but from building new ones alongside the old. Your work with domestic violence charities, your literacy programs, these are creating new traditions of royal service that future queen consorts will be measured against. A knock at the door interrupted them. Charles entered, stopping short when he saw Thomas. Mitchell, I wasn't informed you were here. Thomas immediately bowed. Your Majesty. I came to speak with Her Majesty privately about this morning's events. Charles's expression was unreadable as he looked between his wife and the guard. I see. And have you reached any understanding? Camilla moved to stand beside her husband. We've reached an appreciation for each other's position, I think. Guard Mitchell has helped me understand that this morning's conflict was larger than either of us. Indeed, Charles said slowly. Mitchell, you should know that there have been calls for your dismissal. Some members of the household feel you overstepped your bounds in how you responded to the Queen. Thomas straightened. I understand, Your Majesty. I stand ready to accept whatever consequences you deem appropriate. And others, Charles continued, including the Prime Minister, have called to express their support for your actions, viewing them as a defense of constitutional tradition. The king walked to the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. We find ourselves at crossroads, Mitchell. This incident has forced us to confront questions we've been avoiding. How do we honor tradition while embracing necessary change? How do we respect the past while building for the future? If I may, Your Majesty, Thomas ventured, perhaps the answer lies not in choosing one over the other, but in finding ways for both to coexist. The Guard can maintain its traditions while still showing appropriate respect to Her Majesty. Protocol can be upheld without diminishing anyone's dignity. Charles turned to Camilla. What do you think, my dear? Can we find a middle ground? Camilla was quiet for a long moment. This morning, I wanted revolution. Tonight, I think I'd settle for evolution. But it must be real, Charles. Not just words or gestures, but genuine recognition that the monarchy must adapt or risk becoming irrelevant. Then, let this be the beginning of that conversation, Charles decided. Mitchell, you'll return to duty tomorrow. There will be no disciplinary action. But I want you to be part of a working group we'll establish to review palace protocols and traditions. Your perspective, someone who values tradition but understands the human cost of rigidity, will be valuable. Thomas was stunned. Your Majesty, I'm just a guard. You're a guard who stood at the center of a constitutional crisis and maintained your dignity while showing respect for all involved, Charles corrected. That's exactly the kind of voice we need in these discussions. As Thomas prepared to leave, Camilla called out to him. Guard Mitchell, tomorrow morning, when I pass your post, I won't ask you to break protocol. But perhaps you might find a way within those protocols to show that you see me not just as a person walking by, but as your queen consort, deserving of respect even within the constraints of tradition. Thomas considered this, then nodded slowly. I believe I can do that, ma'am. There are ways, a slight adjustment of timing and movements, a precision in the salute when the royal standard passes, small things that honor both tradition and the person. After he left, Charles and Camilla stood together in the blue drawing room, both lost in thought. The crisis was far from over. The media would continue their coverage, the public would remain divided, and the deeper issues exposed by the confrontation would require months, if not years, to fully address. But something had shifted. The guard who had stood rigid that morning and the queen consort who had demanded recognition had found, if not common ground, at least a mutual understanding of the forces that had brought them into conflict. Outside, the palace lights illuminated the evening sky, a beacon of continuity in a changing world. The protest had largely dispersed, though some die-hard supporters on both sides maintained their vigil. The morning's confrontation had indeed changed the palace forever, though perhaps not in the dramatic, revolutionary way that had seemed possible in those tense moments. Instead, it had opened a door to gradual change, to evolution rather than revolution, to a monarchy that could honor its past while adapting to its future. Thomas Mitchell returned to his modest home in Richmond, evading the remaining journalists, knowing that tomorrow he would once again don his scarlet tunic and bearskin cap. But he would do so with a new understanding of the human cost of tradition and the necessity of balancing rigidity with compassion. In the palace, Camilla retired to her chambers with a sense of exhaustion, but also possibility. The confrontation had been painful, exposing vulnerabilities she usually kept carefully hidden. But it had also forced conversations that needed to happen, open minds that had been closed, and perhaps, just perhaps, begun to bridge the gap between tradition and transformation. The palace had indeed been changed forever, not by revolution, but by the more difficult work of evolution. The slow, sometimes painful process of adapting ancient institutions to modern realities while maintaining their essential character. It would not be easy, and there would be setbacks and conflicts ahead. But the first steps have been taken, and that perhaps was the most significant change of all.